Welcome. I'm Tanya Souza. I'm from the Orleans County Restorative Justice Center in Newport, and I'm here having a conversation with NEK Stoddard. NEK, I understand that you felt really strongly that you wanted to be known as a community member and not by your job title right away. Tell me a little bit about who you are as a community member and why that is.
Oh, sure. So I grew up in the Northeast Kingdom, and that feels really important to me in the work that I do. So any work that I've done in my professional career has been because I feel like I have an understanding of our community and I want to make a difference. Also, the topic was, really talking about some of my own personal experiences as a child who had a parent in prison. And I felt that it was really important with a topic like that can feel really othering to just be really grounded in the fact that I'm a community member, and so are all the other children that have some of the similar experiences.
Now, do you prefer me to use the word incarcerated, in prison, when I'm referring to your parent?
That's a really good question. I think I use either, but yeah, I feel fine with either.
With either one,
Yeah.
Okay. So you answered one of the questions that I had, which was, you're a community member. You have jobs, you have relationships, you have community roles, friends, you go shopping, you do everything everybody does, but that your growing up was a little bit different. So would you speak to that? You started?
Sure, yeah. So in particular, the one main thing that was different, so when I was 3 years old, my biological father was imprisoned. And remained incarcerated until I was 25, and he died in prison. So there was a piece to my family that was taken away. There was a piece to my growing up that really meant that a lot of my formative years were with, as I always kind of described it, like a piece of my heart, like living in prison. And so I was always sort of connected on that level to prison. And I think that that's, something that was really unique in comparative to like my peers, right? Is that I became really familiar with an institution of our society that we don't really talk much about, and that in for my family and for my father generated a lot of harm. And so yeah, so there was pieces, I could go on and on about the pieces there that we don't really talk very much about incarceration or imprisonment. We may talk about the process of somebody, doing wrong and going into prison and I want to say like doing wrong, right? Or being accused of something and going into the prison system. But we don't really talk about all the ins and outs and the ways that by extension, families are impacted.
Exactly.
Or potentially what happens for people who are in prison. So sometimes when we talk about it in ways that, okay, somebody's done wrong, they're handed a punishment, and then that is sort of what is deserving for them. And so as a child, I also felt that piece, like if I were to talk about it, first of all, nobody's talking about it. Everybody wants to talk about it. It's uncomfortable. But if I were to talk about it, then there would be this added judgment of me that I was deserving of having my parent taken away. That's just what happens, right? If you do something wrong. So those are just some of the pieces that were, I guess, unique to my growing up that pertain to that experience.
Now that's a lot of weight to carry, to carry, whether it's inside of yourself or whether you feel it's put on you by other people, the guilt of your parent. Can you speak a little bit more about how it was feeling those things, growing up with those feelings, how it affected you?
That's a complicated one to answer.
Okay. Well, how about this?
Yeah.
How about you had all this on your shoulders, you're a child. What worked? What did adults or other children do, if that was the case, to help you handle that heavy load?
Sure. So a couple different things that I think were really helpful for me in particular. I had so I had my father who was incarcerated. And then I had my mother, and pretty shortly after I had a father who raised me. So I got 2 dads. So I had 3 parents. And internally as a family unit for all of us, they were very intentional about building really strong, healthy relationships, being in as open and honest in communication as possible. Now, mind you, I was 3 years old when my dad went to prison, so those conversations, the depth of honesty and the depth of detail certainly was different, age appropriate as I got older. So there was a lot of intentionality of tending to what could be really difficult for me, and paying attention to what I might be going through. No, don't get me wrong. There, of course, were times when things were very adult world dealt with, and that was hard in its own right. But I think that was a piece of what was done right. I will also say that my father was so much more to me than what his life circumstances were at that time. So more than that, he was in prison. And that was also really intentional on the parts of a lot of people. So my dad was very playful. He was very inquisitive and curious and loved us so much, and was very intentional to put that foot forward, knowing that with so much distance and so much time apart and so many other influences of what could kind of script for me who my dad was, right? Like this person who's guilty or bad or wrong, right? That he was just very thoughtful about being like, here's who I am, so that you have that, right? And then my dad had a lot of people who loved him. And that was really helpful, that those people had clarity about communicating their love for him to me. Sharing with me what their favorite memories of him were. And that allowed me to see my father free, because he was in prison for almost my whole life. So I got those stories of how my dad would, take my aunt out in the canoe, out on our family camp. And so I could be at our camp and I could be there, and I know that my dad shared memories there. And he also would tell stories. So I don't know if I'm getting a little sidetracked, but I think that those were really, really helpful to create a sort of buffer to what I think is often typical, to create a buffer of the silence, right? Where people would be knowing, but just looking at me knowing, not asking like, hey, how are you feeling? Or, possibly teachers or other adults in my life might have known that I went to go visit my father. But there was none of those like questions of how I was doing, or and so people just like making him real to me, that above and beyond, giving me some taste of what he was like free, right? And then him just sharing, I think, was really helpful and helped create kind of a buffer. And then the other adults being as open and honest as they felt, was appropriate, and connecting with me about that.
So you've talked a lot, and well, I might add, about how important it is to have that connection with your parent, male or female, I imagine, if they are in prison or incarcerated. But in your case, that worked very well. It sounds like your dad was a safe person.
Yes.
And for you to see. And it sounds like your mother and your stepdad had a relationship with him.
Yes. Yep.
Which is good.
Yeah, that was very helpful.
Is it always that way? I mean, what do you think? Are there times, I guess, that you shouldn't have a relationship with your parent in prison?
That question's a little bit too big for me to fully answer, but I will say this, that my situation, I recognize and honor the fact that that it was a safe relationship, and that my parents had a really great relationship with each other, and that was very helpful. I also, I've been an advocate for survivors of domestic and sexual violence my whole career. Many of the children that I've met who also share the experience of having parents in prison don't necessarily have that piece of the experience. And so I do think that it's very important to keep in mind the safety and well-being of the child, of course. Was this a safe, nurturing relationship prior to incarceration? If yes, how can it be? With that said, I think that if it is, a safe relationship, and sometimes sometimes even in safe and healthy relationships, I understand, incarceration itself or what might have led to incarceration can be extremely disruptive to relationships. It's sort of built that way, right? People are removed from their communities, they're removed from their families. That creates a great deal of stress. It creates a great deal of stress on families. And so maintaining that might be a little hard, right? Like I want to honor that. And in my own experience, it was not always easy as much as my parents wanted to help maintain that relationship. Not only was it quite expensive, but it can be really hard, when everything's sort of stacked against or stacked more towards like isolating the person in prison and taking them away. So with all that said, I think sometimes it's okay to be creative, because I do think that it's really important if the child wants a relationship and that was a safe relationship, to do what we can and not just have that onus be to do what we can, just looking like insular, like this is this family's thing to deal with, but like are there things we're doing as community members that could help support those relationships being built, kind of help take some of the weight or the stress off of the parent or the guardian that's now with the child, right? Because that's a heavy lift. That's a lot to carry just with dealing, with the circumstances of what it means to have somebody you care about or an extension of your family in prison.
And being a community is being a community. It's not, nobody is really completely alone. No family should completely be alone.
Yep.
Which you read my mind. I was just going to ask you what you thought, like what could I do or what could other community members do to help with the lift?
Yeah.
Do you have some thoughts on that?
I do.
Good. I thought so.
I just might. So the first thing that comes to mind is resources. Mm-hmm. So for me, my father was in prison in New Jersey until I was 12, and then he was in prison in California, and I've lived in Vermont. Oh, wow. And so that was economically extremely taxing, and made it so I didn't see my father as much as I would have loved to, or as much as he would have loved to. There was this fabulous resource that came our way that helped support funding specifically for children to visit their parents. Mm-hmm. And if I hadn't been able to access that funding, I probably would have seen my dad half as much while he was in California. So the first thing that comes to mind is money, resources, right? So what are the things? So in Vermont, so even if somebody's in prison sort of more locally, it still doesn't mean that transportation isn't an issue. Right. But I also know, like for me, and probably so, for everybody who's in prison, but there's a list of people who are allowed to sort of come in and bring children in to visit, or who's allowed to be on somebody's visiting list. And so another resource was having close family members, right? Or people close who could also maybe go and bring us to visit or bring us in. So if it couldn't be my mom or my dad or my stepdad who's raising me, I never call him my stepdad. So, right. But my dad who was, living with us, like at home raising us. So resources to address the barriers, to address the fact that commissary for prisoners is expensive. And I know for us, like at times, if there was something extra that my dad really needed, especially as we got older, we'd really want to try to help provide, right? So like often that's very taxing. Telephone calls are really expensive. So just being really, as community members, being mindful of like the incarceration tax that falls on families that want to continue, that need to and want to continue maintaining that relationship. And then the other thing that, and it's why I wanted to be a part of this with you, is that I think that communities really being aware, right? So it's one of the things that we just don't talk about. And that screams so loud to kids. The things that we as adults are uncomfortable, don't want to talk about, shush away. When a kid is experiencing that, it is so loud to them that nobody wants to talk about it. And what we do is we leave kids alone. We leave them alone to figure it out, to figure something so big out by themselves. So whatever we can do to be talking about it, right? So there's this great, Bill of Rights for kids that have parents who are incarcerated. Any office that I've ever had, I have that Bill of Rights up. There's great books, though I wouldn't be able to name one of them off the top of my head right now, but there's books or, that we can have just even in public community spaces. I know it sounds so simple, but just that says like we're aware that this is something that a child might be facing or a family might be facing, and we care about it. So those are just two of the things, that I could think of. I think also, I do a lot of work in the realm of prevention, and I think that, debunking a lot of like blame and shame around incarceration is also really helpful and is something that we can be addressing as communities together, and just being real about the ripple effect impact that is happening for people in prison and are happening for their families and are happening for us as community members. Just a couple, just a few thoughts.
Well, you have wonderful thoughts, which is why I know you've been thinking a lot about this. You've experienced a lot on so many levels. I also want people who are watching this to know that Hennicus is part of an interview that is featured in our newsletter. There are going to be 3 parts. That we had the first interview with you in September's newsletter, and then there will be a follow-up on a slightly different topic connected to this in October's and November's. So if anybody would be interested in that newsletter, you can contact me at the Orleans County Restorative Justice Center at the information listed below. So Hennicus, thank you very much for being here and helping us with this. There's so much more. We just touched the tip of the iceberg, but I hope you come back another time and maybe we could delve into something else near and dear to your heart.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.